Our evidence review highlighted a few really key lessons. One of those, the fact that when we're looking to advance women's leadership in law and economics, we really need to be working with women's organizations, local women's organizations, and ideally also in partnership with government entities focused on women's rights and gender equality. Now, there's a few reasons why. First off, women's organizations and women's professional networks in particular help promote solidarity and share really important insights with colleagues. And that allows for women working in these male-dominated fields to navigate the complexities of working in a male-dominated field in order to advance and in order to have the networks they need to advance. And so that's very critical. But also what we found, which was quite interesting, is that professional networks are also really important spaces to advance gender equality and to raise awareness around the issues that disproportionately impact women's abilities to participate in economic and social spheres. So for example, we looked at one case study from the International Association of Women's Judges, and we found that not only do they do a lot of activities around creating solidarity and empowerment between women judges in different parts of the world, but they also do a lot of awareness raising. So for example, they raise awareness around gender-based violence, and they hold these practical trainings for judges. And so we see this like dual mechanism, one creating solidarity and helping women move forward as leaders, and then also raising awareness around the issues that affect women, both in that profession and more broadly speaking. Lastly, interventions seeking to accelerate women's leadership in law and economics would be wise to engage with women's organizations, because this helps interventions be more fit for purpose. We found that context is really key when we're thinking about how to support women's leadership. Every country context, every profession, even what level we're talking about in that profession, the barriers to leadership look different. And so we want to make sure that our interventions are very fit for purpose, that they're highly contextualized, and working with local women's organizations, whether that's professional organizations, feminist grassroots organizations, different types of movements. It helps to work with them in order to contextualize our interventions and also ensure that we don't provoke backlash. Local women's organizations are going to have a better understanding of what is appropriate in their context, what is safe to do. And so it's very important for us to be engaging with them for all these different reasons that I just outlined. And then my second point that I want to add here is another key lesson that we learned from the literature review is the importance of multi-level approaches. So again, the pipeline to leadership, it's quite complex, and there's never just one area that is blocking women's advancement to leadership positions. We can look at the education level, look at when a woman is in a position of power and influence. We look at all these different spots, and so it's really important that when we are intervening to support women's leadership, that we're addressing those different areas throughout the pipelines, all those different leaks throughout the pipeline to leadership. So for example, let's say we want to support the advancement of women's leadership within the university's economics department. Great. Networking and mentorship may help prepare women for the challenges that they will likely face in seeking leadership as a woman in this male-dominated profession. However, that intervention alone is not going to address the different systemic and institutional drivers that will stall her advancement. So for example, perhaps paid parental leave, childcare provision, sexual harassment protections. And at the same time, the intervention would be well advised to consider accountability mechanisms. So is there some sort of gender parity target? Is there an effort to monitor progress? And so we want to look at these different sectoral interventions and ensure that it's not just one leak that we're going to address and solve the issue of women's lack of access to these leadership positions. We need to look at a multi-sectoral approach to have a greater impact. One of the data gaps identified through our evidence review was the need for more evidence on the specific conditions needed for successful interventions. So we know that there's some key interventions that have impact: mentorship programs, networking opportunities, etc. However, we don't have as much information on what are the conditions needed for these different interventions. And so, for example, maybe we know we want a mentorship program, but what are the conditions that will allow that mentorship program to really advance women's leadership? Because that's going to look different in different contexts. And furthermore, from a women's rights and indeed a feminist perspective, the argument for tackling the barriers to women's leadership is a normative one. women have a right to equal participation, period. However, we are not only interested in increasing equitable participation, we're also interested in the conditions that allow for feminist leadership. That is what enables women, once they're in positions of leadership, to then use that position to advance feminist goals. And this is where the literature still has a lot of work to go. We know what it takes to start to advance women in leadership, generally speaking, but we don't know the conditions that allow for different interventions to have impact, and furthermore, which intervention or which conditions are needed to allow that woman to not only get in that position of power, but then actually use that position to advance feminist goals. So from our position at Ladysmith, a feminist research collective that connects rigorous academic research with practitioner problem solving, we're really excited to see that there's a growing interest, not only in feminist research methodologies, but also feminist theories of change. And we're seeing how these feminist perspectives are beginning to influence policy and programming. Not beginning, but continuing to have a greater impact. And secondly, so that's hopeful. Secondly, while it's an open question about what direction we're going to go in this post-pandemic world, it's clear that a lot of light has been shed on the gendered impacts of the crisis. And furthermore, not just awareness on the gendered impacts of the crisis, but the fact that these gendered impacts are not a consequence only of COVID-19, but rather there was the conditions clearly set to allow for these multiple and overlapping crises. The crisis only exacerbated, women's risks to violence, economic inequalities, time poverty, and so on. What gives me hope is that not only are we seeing growing awareness on these gendered impacts and on the conditions that have allowed for these gendered impacts, but we're also seeing a movement towards feminist leadership. We're already seeing feminist leaders at the forefront of crafting policies that will help prevent the deep shocks of COVID-19. And I'm hopeful that we'll see more feminist leadership moving forward.